The rifle in her hands was not supposed to work. Not properly, not consistently, not in the way a weapon is supposed to work when lives and records and reputations are on the line. It jammed. It drifted. The trigger pull was so stiff that even experienced shooters had complained about it during routine inspections, and then set it aside like a problem nobody wanted to solve. It had been sitting in the corner of the equipment locker for 3 months before the day Nora Cole walked into the training facility, and someone decided, without much thought and with a great deal of intention, that this was the rifle she would use. Nora was 23 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches. She had brown eyes and steady hands and a calm face that people often mistook for blankness. She was not blank. She was simply a person who had learned early that showing too much on the outside was a way of giving things away for free, and Nora Cole did not give things away for free. She had come from a small town in the north of England, the kind of place where the winters are long and the opinions are longer. Her father worked at a repair shop. Her mother taught primary school. There was nothing in her background that announced her. No military family legacy. No grandfather who had won medals in distant wars. No dramatic origin story with a clean beginning and a neat arc. She had grown up the way most people grow up, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of confusion. And then one day she had picked up a rifle on a school trip to a local shooting range and put 3 shots into the center of a target from 40 meters, and the instructor had gone very quiet before asking her if she had done this before. She had not. She joined a club that same month. By the time she was 16, she was competing. By 18, she had placed in regional events. By 20, she was being watched by people who mattered in ways she did not yet fully understand. By 23, she was standing in a facility that smelled of gun oil and floor cleaner, holding a rifle that had been handed to her with the kind of deliberate casualness that is never actually casual at all. The man who handed it to her was named Gareth Cole, not her father, no relation. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with a closely shaved head and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from having done great things but from having been in rooms where great things were decided. He was the training coordinator for the regional selection program, and he had the power to shape who got placed, who got noticed, and who got sent home with a polite letter and a pat on the shoulder. He handed her the rifle and said nothing. She looked at it. She turned it over in her hands. She noticed the loose tension in the bolt, the way the scope housing had a small hairline crack along the mount, the trigger shoe worn unevenly on the right side. She noticed all of this in about 6 seconds, the way a mechanic notices the sound of an engine before the hood is even open. She looked up at Gareth. He was watching her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it in classrooms, on playing fields, in offices during interviews where the questions were polite and the conclusions were already made. It was the expression of someone waiting to be proven right about something they had already decided. She said, "Thank you." She carried the rifle to her assigned lane. There were 11 other recruits in the facility that day, all of them part of the same regional selection intake, all of them competing for the same limited number of slots in a program that would define the next 3 years of their careers. They were a mixed group in terms of age and background, but they shared one quality in common. They had all been given good equipment. Standard-issue rifles, recently serviced, scopes properly zeroed, triggers set to regulation weight. Clean weapons for people who were expected to have a fair chance. Nora had watched them collect their equipment before she collected hers. She had noticed the difference without saying anything about it. She set the rifle on the bench in front of her and began to strip it. The recruit in the next lane, a young man named Owen Parry, watched her work. He was 25, from Manchester, trained in competitive pistol shooting before making the switch to rifle. He was one of the better shooters in the group, and he knew it, and he wore that knowledge lightly, which is how you know when someone has earned it. He said, "That thing looks like it belongs in a museum." Nora did not look up. Most useful things are old. Owen watched her continue to disassemble the rifle with practiced, unhurried hands. He said, "They gave you that on purpose, you know." She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does that bother you?" She considered the question. She held up the bolt and examined it in the light from the high windows above the range. There was a faint burr along the feed ramp that she had not felt before but could see now. She made a mental note of it. "Things bother me," she said. "I just don't let them change what I'm doing." Owen nodded slowly. He turned back to his own lane and his own well-serviced rifle and did not say anything else, but something in his posture had shifted, the way posture shifts when a person has encountered something they were not expecting and have decided to take it seriously. Nora reassembled the rifle. Then she began to learn it. This is the part of the story that most people do not understand, because most people think of learning a weapon as learning how to use it properly. What Nora was doing was different. She was learning how to use this weapon, with its specific flaws and its specific character, and its specific patterns of failure. She was not trying to fix the rifle. She understood that she could not fix the rifle, not in the time available, not without tools and parts she did not have. What she could do was understand it so thoroughly that its failures became predictable, and predictable failures are manageable. She had learned this principle from a woman named Patricia Grant, who had been her coach for 4 years starting when Nora was 16. Patricia was 60 years old, retired from competitive shooting after a long career, and she had a way of saying very important things very quietly that made you lean forward to hear them. She had told Nora once, during a session where Nora had been struggling with a rifle that kept pulling low left, "The weapon does not owe you anything. You owe the weapon your attention. Pay it and it will tell you everything it knows." Nora had paid attention ever since. She fired her first grouping at 25 meters. The rifle jammed on the third shot as she had expected it would. She cleared the jam. She noted the time it took, 11 seconds the first time. She fired again. It jammed again on the third shot, 8 seconds to clear. She filed that too. By the 6th repetition, she was clearing it in under 6 seconds without breaking her eye position from the target. This is what people who have never been in a situation designed to defeat them do not understand about people who have. The situation is not new, the design is recognizable, and the response is not outrage. The response is efficiency, because outrage costs time, and time is the one currency that cannot be replaced. She spent 3 hours on the range that first evening. When she left, her shoulder ached and her fingers were dry from the gun oil, and she was already calculating the adjustments she would need to make the following morning when the air temperature would be lower, and the rifle's behavior would shift accordingly. She went back to her assigned accommodation, ate the meal that had been left for her, and sat at the small desk by the window with a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote down everything she had learned about the rifle that day. The jam pattern. The scope drift, approximately 1.5 inches left at 25 meters, which she calculated would compound to roughly 4 inches at 100 meters unless she compensated manually. The trigger pull and the precise amount of extra pressure needed to release it cleanly without torquing the muzzle offline. She wrote it all down in small, neat handwriting. Then she read it back once, put the paper in the pocket of her training jacket, and went to sleep. She slept for exactly 5.5 hours. She was awake before her alarm. She lay still for a moment in the dark, not because she was savoring the quiet, but because she was running through the day ahead in her mind, the way athletes do, the way anyone does when they have converted anxiety into preparation. She thought about the rifle. She thought about Gareth, and the way he had handed it to her, and the expression on his face. She thought about all the rooms she had been in before this one. The shooting club where the older men had given her a corner lane away from the main group, and called her the girl, for 6 months before her scores made that particular habit too embarrassing to maintain. The regional qualifier where someone had filed a formal objection to her placement on the grounds that her equipment had not been properly inspected, an objection that evaporated when the equipment check came back clean. The interview for this program, during which one of the 3 interviewers had asked her, with genuine curiosity rather than malice, whether she was sure this was the environment she wanted to be in. She had said yes. She had said it the same way she always said everything that mattered, quietly, without drama, with the full weight of certainty behind it. She got up, dressed, picked up her training jacket with the paper in the pocket, and walked back to the range. 12 days until the selection event. She had work to do. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside, a sharp, clean cold that cleared the last of the sleep from her eyes. She walked across the empty courtyard, her boots loud on the wet stone. Nobody else was up yet. The facility was quiet in the gray morning light, just the faint sound of wind against the high walls and the distant mechanical hum of the heating system. She reached the range building, unlocked it with her access card, and stepped inside. She picked up the rifle from the secure rack. She held it for a moment, the way you hold something you are coming to know, feeling its weight and its balance and its particular, stubborn character. Then she got to work. Owen Perry arrived at the range 40 minutes later and found her already on her 6th grouping. He stood at the entrance for a moment and watched her shoot. He watched her clear the jam, adjust, fire again. He watched the way she moved. Not fast, not slow, just continuous, like something that does not spend energy on unnecessary motion. He walked to his lane without saying anything. He shot for an hour, then he stopped and looked over at her target. The groupings were small. Not perfect, not yet, but small in the way that tells you something real about the person behind the trigger. He looked at her. She was reloading, not looking back at him. He said, "You've been here a while." She said, 4:30. He said, "That's early." She said, "It's enough." He thought about that for the rest of the morning. Outside, the rest of the intake was beginning to arrive. Doors opened. Boots crossed wet stone. Voices moved through the corridor. The day was starting, and with it the structured training sessions that would define the schedule for the next 12 days, the drills and the assessments and the observations that would be added to files and turned into decisions. Nora Cole put down her rifle, rolled her shoulder once, and went to join them. She did not look back at the lane. She did not need to. She already knew what the rifle could do. She already knew what she could do. The next 12 days were not a mystery. They were a confirmation, and confirmations belong to people who have already done the work before anyone is watching. She had been doing the work for 7 years. She was ready. The thing about being underestimated is that it requires maintenance. The people doing it have to keep doing it, even as the evidence shifts, because to stop would be to admit that they started on false grounds. Nora had watched this happen before. She watched it happen now in the way certain eyes slid past her in group briefings, in the way her name was spoken last when instructors called attendance, in the small and consistent accumulation of signals that told her exactly where she stood in other people's expectations. She used all of it, not as motivation in the way motivational speakers describe motivation. She used it as information. If they expected her to fall behind, they would not be watching for the moments when she did not. And the moments when she did not were the moments that mattered. She had 12 days. She knew exactly what to do with them. The second morning of training, the structured sessions began in full. The group assembled at 7 in the main briefing room, a wide, low-ceilinged space with metal chairs and a whiteboard at the front, and the kind of lighting that makes everyone look slightly tired. Gareth Cole stood at the front of the room with a clipboard and spoke for 20 minutes about the schedule, the assessment criteria, and the expectations of the program. He spoke in a flat, professional tone that gave nothing away, the voice of someone who had given this speech many times and had long since stopped finding it interesting. Nora sat in the third row and listened to every word. She was not listening for the content. She already knew the content, having read the program documentation twice before arriving. She was listening for the gaps, the things said, and the things not said, and the spaces between them where the real information lived. She had learned to do this from Patricia, who believed that the most important thing a shooter could develop was not accuracy but attention, and that attention was not a natural gift but a trained habit, built repetition by repetition like any other skill. When Gareth finished speaking, he asked if there were questions. A man named Daniel Hurst put his hand up. He was 27, from London, and had a way of speaking that suggested he had grown up being listened to. He asked a question about the scoring system for the final selection event, specifically whether grouping size or total score would carry more weight in the final assessment. Gareth said it was a combination of both, weighted 60-40 toward total score. Daniel nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Nora wrote it down. The morning session was a drill exercise at 50 meters, structured as a series of timed sequences with specific requirements for position changes between shots. Prone to standing, standing to kneeling, kneeling back to prone. Each transition had to be completed within a set time, and the shots fired from each position had to land within a defined scoring zone on the target. It was a test of multiple things at once: physical coordination, weapon handling, breath control, the ability to maintain accuracy while the body was still recovering from movement. Most of the intake found it manageable. Several found it difficult. One recruit, a young woman named Claire Ashby, struggled with the standing position and lost significant points on her first 2 runs through the sequence. Nora found it difficult in a different way. The rifle made the position changes harder. Its weight was distributed poorly, heavier at the muzzle end than a properly maintained weapon would be, and the stiff trigger meant that any residual tremor from physical movement was more likely to disturb her aim. She had to pause longer between transitions than she wanted to, waiting for her body to settle before she fired. She came in third on the first run. She came in second on the second run. She did not come in first, and she did not expect to, not yet, because first was not the point. The point was the data. Every run through the sequence gave her more information about how the rifle behaved under physical stress, how long it needed to settle, how much the trigger pull amplified or reduced movement compared to a stationary position. She was building a model of the rifle in her mind, detailed and precise, and every session added to it. Owen Perry came in first on both runs. He moved cleanly and efficiently, and his groupings in the standing position were the tightest Nora had seen from any of the other recruits. He was good. He was genuinely good, and she respected it without feeling threatened by it, because she was not competing against Owen Perry. She was competing against a version of herself that did not yet exist but would by the time the selection event arrived. After the morning session, the group had a 30-minute break. Most of them gathered near the building entrance, talking and drinking coffee from a machine in the corridor. Nora went back to her lane with the rifle. She had 30 minutes. She used them. A man named Stuart Coles, one of the program observers who sat at the back of the range during sessions and took notes on clipboards, noticed her. Stuart was 53 years old, lean and quiet, with sharp eyes and the economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in environments where unnecessary action is its own kind of weakness. He had been doing this work for 18 years. He had seen a great many recruits pass through this facility. He watched Nora shoot for 10 minutes. Then he wrote something on his clipboard and underlined it twice. He did not tell anyone what he had written. That was not his role. His role was to observe and record, and he was very good at his role, and what he had seen in those 10 minutes was something he had only seen a handful of times in 18 years, which was a shooter who was not shooting at a target but was solving a problem, methodically and without visible frustration. The way an engineer works through a fault in a system they are determined to understand. The break ended, the group reassembled, the afternoon session began. It was a longer sequence, 100 meters, with a wind reading that added a lateral element to the challenge. The targets were smaller, and the scoring zones were tighter, and several recruits who had performed well in the morning struggled with the extended distance. Nora had been thinking about the 100-meter wind correction since the previous evening. She had calculated it based on the scope drift she had documented on her first day, knowing that the drift would be more pronounced at longer distances, and that the wind correction would need to account for both the natural ballistic drift and the equipment-specific drift simultaneously. It was not a simple calculation. She had worked through it 3 times on the paper in her jacket pocket. She fired her first shot, and it landed 6 inches high and 2 inches right of where she had aimed. She adjusted. Second shot, 4 inches high, 1 inch right. She adjusted again. Third shot, 2 inches high, center line. By her 5th shot, she was grouping consistently within the scoring zone. This was not as fast as it should have been, and she knew it. In a proper assessment, she would have lost significant points on those first 4 shots, but the pattern of adjustment was the thing she needed, the precise relationship between her calculated correction and the rifle's actual behavior at this distance in these conditions, and now she had it. She filed it. She would not need those 4 calibration shots again. After the afternoon session, Gareth Cole reviewed the day's scores on the whiteboard. He read them in order from highest to lowest. Daniel Hurst was first. Owen Perry was second. 3 other names followed. Then Nora Cole. She was 6th. Of 12. She was not where she needed to be. She knew it. She was also 6 days into 12, and she was holding a rifle that had cost her 4 calibration shots at 100 meters, and she had not yet used everything she had learned. The gap between where she was and where she needed to be was real, but it was not the kind of gap that closed with effort alone. It closed with the specific, directed application of everything she had been building since day 1. She went back to her room that evening. She ate. She sat at the desk. She updated her notes on the rifle. She wrote down the wind correction figures. She wrote down the adjustment sequence from the afternoon session. She read it all back. Then she drew a line across the bottom of the page. Below the line she wrote 4 words. She stared at them for a moment. Then she folded the paper, put it in her jacket pocket, and went to bed. The 4 words were, "Now it gets serious." The days that followed had a rhythm to them that was deceptive in its consistency. On the surface, every day looked like the one before. Early mornings, structured sessions, scores posted, evenings spent on preparation. But underneath that surface something was shifting, the way a tide shifts, which is to say continuously and not always visibly, but with a force that eventually cannot be ignored. Nora's scores began to move. Not dramatically, not in the way that attracts attention and generates commentary. They moved in the way real progress moves, which is incrementally, session by session, a fraction at a time. 6th became 5th. 5th became 4th. Each improvement was small enough that it could be explained away as normal variance, as a good day, as luck. But the direction never reversed. She did not have bad days that pulled her back. She moved in one direction only, and that direction was forward. By day 8 she was 3rd. On day 9, Owen Perry stopped her after the morning session and said, "What are you doing differently?" She said, "Nothing different, just more of the same." He looked at her for a moment, deciding whether this was an honest answer or a polite deflection. He concluded, correctly, that it was both. He said, "The rifle is still the same one they gave you on day 1. She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been watching your adjustments. You're compensating for something on every shot. That has to be exhausting." She said, "It's what I've got." He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. He said, "For what it's worth, I think what they did was wrong." She looked at him. It was the first time anyone had said it plainly, without softening it or framing it as something else. She found that she appreciated it more than she had expected to. She said, "Thank you." He nodded and walked away. She watched him go, and then she went back to her lane, and she shot for another 40 minutes until the next session began. Outside, the weather had turned colder. There was frost on the courtyard in the mornings that did not fully melt until midday, and the wind at the range had become a permanent variable that had to be accounted for in every calculation. Some of the recruits found the cold a difficulty. Nora found it useful. She had grown up in northern England. Cold was familiar. Cold was a thing she knew how to work inside. The rifle, she had discovered, behaved differently in the cold. The metal contracted slightly, which changed the tension in the bolt mechanism and made the jam pattern slightly less predictable. She had adjusted for this. She was always adjusting. On day 10, during the afternoon session, something happened that had not happened before. She came in first. The session was a 50-meter prone sequence, 8 shots in a defined time window, and she shot it cleanly. Every shot inside the scoring zone. No jams. The compensation she had built over 10 days of practice was now so deeply embedded in her muscle memory that she was not consciously applying it. She was just shooting, and the shots were landing where she intended them to land, which is the only thing that ultimately matters. When the scores were read out that evening, her name was first. The room was quiet for a moment. Gareth Cole read the name without inflection. He moved on to the next score immediately. But in that brief silence, Nora heard something shift, not in the room exactly, in the air of the room, in the attention of the people in it. She had been seen. 2 days left before the selection event. She went back to her room, sat at her desk, and updated her notes one more time. Then she put the paper in her pocket and did not take it out again. She did not need it anymore. Everything on it was already inside her. She had read it enough times. She had shot enough times. The gap between the rifle she had been given and the performance she needed to produce had been closed, not by fixing the rifle but by becoming, through 10 days of relentless, focused, unglamorous work, exactly the kind of shooter who did not need the rifle to be fixed. She sat at the window for a while and watched the frost form on the courtyard below. Then she went asleep. The selection event was held on the final morning of the program. It was a single, structured assessment, 1.5 hours long, covering multiple distances and positions, designed to test everything the recruits had worked on over the preceding 12 days. The scores from this event would be combined with the daily training scores to produce a final ranking, and from that ranking, 6 slots would be filled. There were 12 recruits, 6 slots, half would go home. The morning was cold and still, the first windless morning since the program had begun. Nora noticed this when she stepped outside at 5. She stood in the courtyard for a moment and felt the absence of the wind, the strange stillness of it, and she recalculated. The wind had been a constant variable in her preparation. Without it, her adjustments would need to shift. She went to the range and shot for 45 minutes, recalibrating for the still air, updating the model in her head. When she was done, she went back to her room, ate breakfast, dressed in her full kit, and returned to the range building with the rest of the intake at 7. The atmosphere in the briefing room that morning was different from every morning before it. Not louder, not more dramatic, just tighter, the way air feels tighter before a storm. People were quieter. The small talk that had been a fixture of previous mornings was mostly absent. Everyone understood that the easy part was over. Gareth Cole stood at the front of the room. He reviewed the format of the assessment one final time. He reminded them of the scoring criteria. He reminded them that equipment checks would be completed before the event began. Nora listened. Equipment checks meant the rifles would be inspected by the program officials. She had known this was coming. She had spent the previous evening ensuring the rifle was as clean and functional as she could make it without replacing any components. The bolt was clean. The scope was as stable as she could make it. The trigger was the trigger. Nothing about that would change. The equipment check was completed by two officials who were not part of the regular training staff. They moved methodically through the rack of rifles. When they reached Nora's weapon, the first official examined it for several seconds longer than he had examined the others. He turned it over. He checked the bolt. He looked at the scope mount. He looked at Gareth. Gareth said nothing. The official looked at Nora and said, "This is the weapon you've been using for the duration of the program." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you're prepared to use it for the assessment?" She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, and then he wrote something on his form and moved on. The recruits were assigned to their lanes in the order they had been listed on the training roster. Nora was in Lane 4, toward the center of the range. Owen Perry was in Lane 7. Daniel Hurst was in Lane 2. The assessment began at 8 o'clock precisely. The first stage was prone at 50 meters, 8 shots timed. This was Nora's most practiced distance. She settled into position, took 3 slow breaths and began. She shot the 8 rounds in sequence. The rifle jammed on the 6th shot. She cleared it in 5.5 seconds, fired her 7th, fired her 8th. When she looked at the target through the spotting scope afterward, 7 of her 8 shots were in the center scoring zone. The 8th was slightly outside, pulled by the recovery from the jam. 7 out of 8, solid. The second stage was standing at 75 meters. This was the position she had worked hardest on, the one where the rifle's weight distribution made the most difference, the one that had cost her the most in the early days of training. She had spent more hours on this position than any other. She stood, she raised the rifle. She settled her breathing. She shot. Every round landed inside the scoring zone. She did not look at the other lanes. She did not look at the board where officials were tracking scores in real time. She looked at her target, and then she looked at the next stage of the assessment, and she moved forward. The third stage was prone at 100 meters. This was the distance where the scope drift mattered most, where the compensation had to be precise and consistent, where the difference between understanding the rifle and almost understanding it would show up clearly in the results. She had shot this distance more times than she could count. She settled, she adjusted, she breathed. She shot. The sequence took 11 minutes. When it was over and the officials walked to the targets to record the scores, she watched them move to hers, and she watched one of them lean in to look closely at the grouping, and then write on his board without looking up. She did not know the score yet. She did not need to. She had felt every shot. She knew the way shooters know which ones were true and which ones had something unresolved in them. Most of them had been true. The fourth and final stage was a combined sequence at mixed distances, a test of adaptability rather than pure accuracy, requiring the shooter to move between positions and distances in a structured order with defined time windows for each transition. It was the most complex stage and the one that had produced the most inconsistency in training, because it required the shooter to manage everything simultaneously: position, breath, time, distance, equipment. For Nora, it required one additional thing. It required her to manage the rifle. She had been managing the rifle for 12 days. She was very good at it now. She moved through the sequence with the particular, unhurried precision that had become her signature over the preceding weeks. Not fast in the way that looks impressive. Fast in the way that is actually efficient, which is a different thing and a harder thing, because efficiency does not come from effort alone. It comes from having done something enough times that the decisions are no longer decisions but reflexes, and reflexes do not hesitate. The rifle jammed once during the combined sequence. She cleared it in 5 seconds. She continued. She did not lose her position. She did not lose her breath. She did not lose her place in the sequence. She finished. She put the rifle down on the bench, stepped back from the lane, and waited. Around her, the other recruits were finishing at their own pace. Owen Perry finished 2 minutes after she did. Daniel Hurst finished 30 seconds after that. The last recruit to complete the assessment was Claire Ashby, who had struggled throughout the program but had improved steadily, and who crossed the finish line of the final sequence with a composure that Nora found genuinely admirable. The officials collected all the scores. They went into the briefing room. The recruits waited in the range. Nobody spoke much. Someone got a cup of coffee from the machine in the corridor and came back with it, and the smell of it moved through the space and made several people realize they were cold. Nora stood near her lane with her back against the wall and her arms loose at her sides and her eyes on the door of the briefing room. She was not thinking about the score. She was thinking about the rifle. She was thinking about the first evening, when she had sat at the bench for 3 hours learning its patterns. She was thinking about 4:30 in the morning on the second day, when the range had been empty and cold, and she had been the only person in it. She was thinking about the 10 days of sessions and notes and adjustments, the incremental, unseen work of turning a disadvantage into a known quantity, of turning a problem into a language she could speak. She was thinking about Patricia Grant, sitting across a workbench with her quiet voice and her patient eyes, saying, "The weapon does not owe you anything. You owe the weapon your attention." She had paid the attention. The door of the briefing room opened. Gareth Cole walked out with a sheet of paper in his hand. He walked to the front of the range. He held the sheet of paper the way he held everything, with a flat, professional composure that gave nothing away. He looked at the group. He said, "I will read the final rankings. These rankings combine your training scores and today's assessment in the ratio outlined in the program documentation." He looked down at the sheet. He read the first name. It was Nora Cole. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In that range on that morning, it was very long. It was the length of time it takes for a room full of people to process something that contradicts what they expected, to run it back through everything they thought they knew, and find that the result is the same each time. The name at the top of the list is the name at the top of the list, and that is what the numbers say, and the numbers do not negotiate. Owen Perry was second, Daniel Hurst was third, 3 others followed. 6 names, 6 slots. The program had its cohort. Gareth Cole folded the paper. He congratulated the 6 selected recruits with the same flat professionalism he used for everything. He informed the remaining 6 that they would be contacted about alternative pathways and future application cycles. He said a few words about the program, about what came next, about expectations. Nora heard approximately half of it. The other half was lost to a sensation she had not anticipated, which was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter than both of those things. Something that felt, more than anything else, like the specific satisfaction of having been right about something important that other people said was wrong. Not vindication in the sharp, loud sense. Something more private than that. Something she would not have been able to name precisely and did not particularly want to, because naming it would have required explaining it, and she was not in the habit of explaining herself. Owen found her afterward, outside in the courtyard. He said, "I want you to know that I am not even slightly surprised." She looked at him. He said, "I mean that. I've been watching you since day 2. I knew by day 4. She said, "You should have told Gareth." He said, "I thought I didn't need to. I thought the numbers would do it." She said, "They did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That rifle should never have been given to you. That was wrong." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you won anyway." She said, "I was always going to." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, somewhere between admiration and something that might have been a complicated kind of regret, the feeling of someone who has witnessed an injustice be overcome and is not entirely sure how to hold both of those things at once. He said, "What happens now for you?" She said, "I join the program. I train, I get better." He said, "With a better rifle." She almost smiled. It was the closest she came to it all day. She said, "I don't need a better rifle." He laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, the kind that comes out of you before you have decided to let it. He shook his head and said, "No. I suppose you don't." They stood in the courtyard for a while after that, not talking much, just standing in the cold air while the facility moved around them, doors opening and closing, people collecting their things, the administrative machinery of endings doing its work. Then Owen said he needed to go make a call, and she said she did too, and they went in opposite directions across the courtyard, and that was that. She went to her room. She sat at the desk. She took out the piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She read through it one last time. The jam patterns, the drift calculations, the trigger compensation, the wind figures, the adjustment sequences. 12 days of careful, quiet, invisible work, documented in small, neat handwriting on a piece of paper that nobody else had ever seen, and nobody else had ever needed to see. She folded it once. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in the bin beside the desk and went to pack her things. The program began 3 weeks after the selection event, in a different facility, in a different part of the country. It was larger and better equipped, the ranges were longer, the training was more demanding. The other people in it were, with very few exceptions, the best shooters any of them had ever trained alongside. People who had come through their own selection processes and their own proving periods and arrived here with the particular quiet intensity of those who have already decided what they are doing with their lives. Nora arrived on the first day with one bag and the rifle she had been assigned for the program. It was a good rifle, properly maintained, recently calibrated, well-balanced, with a trigger set to regulation weight and a scope that was clean and true. She picked it up, and the difference was immediately apparent, the way it sat in her hands, the way the bolt moved, the absence of the familiar resistance she had been working against for 12 days. She stripped it anyway. The instructor who ran the first morning session was a woman named Ellen Draper, 45 years old, 20 years in competitive and professional shooting, with the kind of credentials that take a career to build and the kind of manner that belongs to people who have nothing left to prove to anyone. She watched the recruits handle their weapons during the initial inspection and said very little, making notes on her own clipboard, building her first impressions. When she came to Nora, she watched her work for a moment. She said, "Previous experience with this model?" Nora said, "No, but I'm getting familiar with it." Ellen said, "How long does that usually take you?" Nora said, "Depends on the weapon." Ellen looked at the rifle and then at Nora. She said, "This one's well behaved." Nora said, "I can tell." Ellen made a note. She moved on. In the first week of the program, the recruits underwent a series of baseline assessments designed to establish where each person was starting from, the foundation on which the next 3 years of training would be built. They were not competitive in the way the selection event had been. They were diagnostic. The instructors were not looking for winners. They were looking for information. Nora's baseline scores placed her second in the group, a fraction behind a man named Alan Frost, who was 28 and had been shooting competitively since he was 14, and whose technique was so clean and so complete that watching him was less like watching a person and more like watching a mechanism that had been designed specifically for the purpose of putting bullets through the center of targets. She was not troubled by being second. She was interested in him, the way she was interested in anyone who was genuinely better at something than she was, because genuine superiority is always instructive. She studied how he moved, how he breathed, how he managed transitions. She added what she observed to the ongoing model she was building, not of a rifle this time, but of a standard, a level of performance she could use to orient her own development. By the end of the first month, the gap between them had narrowed. By the end of the third month, they were producing effectively identical baseline scores. Alan noticed. He came to her after a session one morning and said, "You've been closing the distance." She said, "I've been working." He said, "So have I." She said, "I know, that's what makes it interesting." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when they have recognized something they were not sure they would find here. A peer, an equal, someone to measure yourself against who will not hold still for you. He said, "Good." She said, "Yes." Ellen Draper watched this exchange from the far end of the range, where she was reviewing notes from the morning session. She had been watching Nora Cole for 3 months. She had been watching the scores, the rate of improvement, the quality of the technique. She had also been watching something harder to quantify, which was the way Nora approached problems, the methodical and undramatic way she moved through difficulty, the absence of panic and the presence of what Ellen could only describe in her private notes as structural patience. She had called Patricia Grant 2 weeks into the program, because Patricia Grant's name was in Nora's file as her previous coach, and Ellen made a point of talking to previous coaches. The two women had spoken for 40 minutes. At the end of the conversation, Ellen had said, "She's going to be exceptional." Patricia had said, "She already is. The program will just make it visible." Ellen had thought about that sentence many times since then. Making things visible. That was what the program was in the end, not the place where Nora Cole became something, the place where what she had always been became impossible to overlook. Gareth Cole had submitted his documentation on the selection event within the standard 7-day window. The paperwork was filed. The cohort was confirmed. The program had its people. Somewhere in that documentation, buried in the administrative prose of official records, was the fact that Nora Cole had completed a 12-day selection program using a weapon that was rated as functionally deficient by the program's own equipment standards, and had produced the highest final score of the intake. He had not added commentary to this fact. It was in the record. Facts do not require commentary. Stuart Coles, the program observer who had watched Nora shoot during the break on day 2 and underlined something twice on his clipboard, submitted his own observer notes through the separate reporting channel that existed for exactly this purpose. His notes were detailed and specific. They described what he had seen, a recruit who had been given inadequate equipment and had responded not with complaint or deterioration, but with a systematic, sustained effort to understand and master that equipment. They described the pattern of her improvement over 12 days. They described the final assessment scores. At the bottom of his notes, he had written one sentence that was slightly outside the normal register of his reports. He had written, "I have been doing this work for 18 years. I have seen this once before. Do not waste her." That note went into a file. The file was read by 2 people above Gareth Cole's level. Those 2 people had a conversation about it. That conversation resulted in a recommendation, which was attached to Nora's program file, which would be waiting for whoever reviewed it at the end of her first year. She did not know about any of this. She was at the range. She was shooting. The good rifle was in her hands, clean and true and exactly what it was supposed to be, and she was learning it the way she learned everything, completely and without shortcuts, building the map of it inside herself until the distance between her intention and her result was as small as she could make it, which was very small, which was getting smaller every day. Outside the range building, the winter was coming to an end. The mornings were still cold, but the light was changing, arriving earlier and lasting longer. the particular quality of light that belongs to the turn of a season, when everything is still in the position it occupied through the dark months, but something in the air has shifted, and the change, though not yet visible, is already decided. Nora Cole had been shooting since she was 12. She had been underestimated since shortly after that. She had been doing the same thing in response to both of those facts, which was working, specifically and continuously and without drama, toward a level of skill that would eventually make both of them irrelevant. She was not there yet, but she was close. And she was the kind of person who, once she was that close, did not stop. 3 years later, the results of the regional championship were posted on a board in a facility that Nora had visited once before, on a different occasion, under different circumstances. She was 26 now. The program had changed her in the ways that 3 years of serious, expert-guided training always changes a person, which is to say it had not changed who she was but had made what she was capable of significantly larger. She moved differently. She thought about shooting differently. The conversations she had been having in her own head about technique and adjustment and preparation had become more sophisticated, more detailed, more nuanced, in the way that all conversations become more sophisticated and detailed and nuanced as the person having them gets better at the subject. Alan Frost was standing beside her when the results went up. He was first. She was second. The margin between them was 4 points, out of a total possible score that was very large, which meant the margin was very small. Alan looked at the board and said, 4 points. She said, I'll get it next time. He said, you've been saying that for 3 years. She said, and every time the gap has been smaller. He looked at her, he said, it has. She said, 4 points is almost nothing. He said, 4 points is 4 points. She said, for now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I genuinely hope you do. I want to be beaten by someone who has actually beaten me. She looked at him. He said, 4 points is not being beaten. 4 points is being fractionally ahead. It is not the same thing as winning, not when the other person is you. She said, that's a very gracious thing to say. He said, I mean it without grace. I mean it as a statement of fact. She nodded. Then she looked at the board again for a moment, at her name and the number beside it, at the small distance between where she was and where she intended to be. She had been here before, not in this facility, not with these specific numbers, but in this position, close, not close enough, with a clear and knowable gap between her current performance and the performance she was working toward. She had been in this position many times. She knew what to do with it. She turned away from the board. She went back to work. Ellen Draper was waiting for her in the corridor outside the results room. Ellen had watched the championship from the observer section, as she always did when her recruits were competing. She had been following Nora's scores for 3 years, and she had a clear picture of the trajectory, which was a line that only went in one direction. She said, second. Nora said, this time. Ellen said, you want to talk about the 4 points? Nora said, not yet. I need to think about them first. Ellen nodded. She said, you have the analysis session tomorrow morning. Nora said, I know. Ellen said, I'll have the full scoring breakdown ready. Nora said, thank you. Ellen started to turn away, then she stopped. She said, for what it's worth, Nora, in 20 years of watching people shoot, I have seen a handful who had what you have. The patience, the method, the ability to work through something hard without losing yourself in it. Nora looked at her. Ellen said, you will be first, not because I'm saying it as a coach, because the work says it. Nora said, I know. Ellen looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, the slow, certain nod of someone who has just had something confirmed that they already understood. She left. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. The facility hummed around her. Voices moved through other rooms. Doors opened and closed, the ordinary machinery of a day. She thought about the rifle. Not the good rifle she was shooting now, the other one. The one from the selection event, from the first 12 days, from the early mornings and the late evenings, and the piece of paper in her jacket pocket. She thought about what it had taken to learn that weapon, to refuse to be defined by it, to close the gap between what it was and what she needed it to be through nothing other than sustained, careful, patient work. 4 points was nothing compared to that gap. She had closed that gap. She could close this one. She walked back to her accommodation. She ate. She sat at the desk, the same posture she had learned in that first facility, back straight, paper in front of her, pen in her hand. She wrote at the top of the page, 4 points. Underneath that she wrote everything she could remember about the moments in the championship where those 4 points had been lost. She wrote about the third stage and the wind shift she had not fully accounted for. She wrote about the standing sequence and the one shot that had pulled right at the worst possible moment. She wrote about the transition between prone and kneeling where she had taken a half-second too long, and the time cost had compressed her breathing window. She wrote until she had documented every point, every cause, every adjustment that was available to her. Then she looked at the page. It was solvable. All of it was solvable. Not tonight, not in one session, but over time, with the kind of targeted, specific work that she had been doing her whole life. She folded the page. She put it in her jacket pocket. She went asleep. She was up before 4. She was at the range before anyone else. The rifle was exactly where she had left it. She picked it up. She began. The scores from the regional championship were entered into the national record system the following week. When the program administrators reviewed them as part of the annual performance assessment cycle, Nora Cole's name appeared in the national ranking for the first time. She was inside the top 15 of several hundred registered competitive shooters at her level. Using a program that she had entered through a selection event where she had been handed a deficient weapon and had produced the highest score of the intake. Nobody made a speech about this. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The number appeared in the database, accurate and precise, and the database recorded it without sentiment because that is what numbers do. But the people who read those numbers, the people whose job it was to track trajectories and identify talent and make decisions about where resources and attention should go, those people had conversations. Quiet conversations in offices over coffee. About a woman named Nora Cole. About where she had come from and what she had done, and what the direction of her scores suggested about where she was going. About the selection event 3 years ago, and the documentation that had been filed, and the observer note with the single sentence at the bottom. Do not waste her. They had not wasted her. And she, for her part, had not wasted a single day. That was the agreement, though it had never been spoken. She would do the work, all of it, without complaint and without drama, and the work would eventually speak in a language that could not be talked over or set aside or handed to someone more convenient. It was speaking now, loud and clear and getting louder. She was at the range every morning before the light came. She was there when it arrived. She was still there when it moved across the targets and turned the afternoon gold and then faded and the cold came back, and the range lights clicked on, and the evening settled around her like something familiar. She put the rifle down. She rolled her shoulder. She looked at the target. She had 3 things to fix. She had identified them this morning, and she had worked on 2 of them through the day, and she would work on the 3rd tomorrow, and then she would run the full sequence again and see where she was. That was what came next. That was what always came next. Not the championship, not the ranking, not the conversation that was happening right now in an office somewhere over coffee about her name and her numbers and her future. The next shot. the one that was going to be better than the one before it. She picked up the rifle. She looked at the target. She breathed.